We were in the outskirts of Guaymas in northern Mexico on a drive from Nogales, Arizona, when it became evident to me that something was wrong with Don Juan. For the last hour or so, he had been unusually quiet and somber. I didn't think anything of it, but then abruptly his body twitched out of control. His chin hit his chest as if his neck muscles could no longer support the weight of his head. "Are you getting carsick, Don Juan?" I asked, suddenly alarmed. He didn't answer. He was breathing through his mouth. During the first part of our drive, which had taken several hours, he had been fine. We had talked a great deal about everything. When we had stopped in the city of Santa Ana to get gas, he was even doing push-outs against the roof of the car to loosen up the muscles of his shoulders. "What's wrong with you, Don Juan?" I asked. I felt pangs of anxiety in my stomach. With his head down, he mumbled that he wanted to go to a particular restaurant and, in a slow, faltering voice, gave me precise directions on how to get there. I parked my car on a side street a block from the restaurant. As I opened the car door on my side, he held on to my arm with an iron grip. Painfully, and with my help, he dragged himself out of the car over the driver's seat. Once he was on the sidewalk, he held onto my shoulders with both hands to straighten his back. In ominous silence, we shuffled down the street toward the dilapidated building where the restaurant was. Don Juan was hanging onto my arm with all his weight. His breathing was so accelerated, and the tremor in his body so alarming, that I panicked. I stumbled and had to brace myself against the wall to keep us both from falling to the sidewalk. My anxiety was so intense I couldn't think. I looked into his eyes. They were dull. They didn't have their usual shine. We clumsily entered the restaurant, and a solicitous waiter rushed over, as if on cue, to help Don Juan. "How are you feeling today?" he yelled into Don Juan's ear. He practically carried Don Juan from the door to a table, seated him, and then disappeared. "Does he know you, Don Juan?" I asked when we were seated. Without looking at me, he mumbled something unintelligible. I stood up and went to the kitchen to look for the busy waiter. "Do you know the old man I'm with?" I asked when I was able to corner him. "Of course I know him," he said with the attitude of someone who has just enough patience to answer one question. "He's the old man who suffers from strokes." That statement settled things for me. I knew then that Don Juan had suffered a mild stroke while we were driving. There was nothing I could have done to avoid it, but I felt helpless and apprehensive. The feeling that the worst had not yet happened made me feel sick to my stomach. I went back to the table and sat down in silence. Suddenly, the same waiter arrived with 2 plates of fresh shrimp and 2 large bowls of sea turtle soup. The thought occurred to me that either the restaurant served only shrimp and sea turtle soup, or Don Juan ate the same thing every time he was here. The waiter talked so loudly to Don Juan he could be heard above the clatter of customers. "Hope you like your food," he yelled. "If you need me, just lift your arm. I'll come right away." Don Juan nodded his head affirmatively, and the waiter left, after patting Don Juan affectionately on the back. Don Juan ate voraciously, smiling to himself from time to time. I was so apprehensive that just the thought of food made me feel nauseous. But then I reached a familiar threshold of anxiety, and the more I worried, the hungrier I became. I tried the food and found it incredibly good. I felt somewhat better after having eaten, but the situation hadn't changed, nor had my anxiety diminished. When Don Juan was through eating, he shot his arm straight above his head. In a moment, the waiter came over and handed me the bill. I paid him, and he helped Don Juan stand up. He guided him by the arm out of the restaurant. The waiter even helped him out to the street and said goodbye to him effusively. We walked back to the car in the same laborious way, Don Juan leaning heavily on my arm, panting and stopping to catch his breath every few steps. The waiter stood in the doorway, as if to make sure I wasn't going to let Don Juan fall. Don Juan took 2 or 3 full minutes to climb into the car. "Tell me, what can I do for you, Don Juan?" I pleaded.
"Turn the car around," he ordered in a faltering, barely audible voice. "I want to go to the other side of town, to the store. They know me there, too. They are my friends."
I told him I had no idea what store he was talking about. He mumbled incoherently and had a tantrum. He stamped on the floor of the car with both feet. He pouted and actually drooled on his shirt. Then he seemed to have an instant of lucidity. I got extremely nervous, watching him struggle to arrange his thoughts. He finally succeeded in telling me how to get to the store. My discomfort was at its peak. I was afraid that the stroke Don Juan had suffered was more serious than I thought. I wanted to be rid of him, to take him to his family or his friends, but I didn't know who they were. I didn't know what else to do. I made a U-turn and drove to the store, which he said was on the other side of town. I wondered about going back to the restaurant to ask the waiter if he knew Don Juan's family. I hoped someone in the store might know him. The more I thought about my predicament, the sorrier I felt for myself. Don Juan was finished. I had a terrible sense of loss, of doom. I was going to miss him, but my sense of loss was offset by my feeling of annoyance at being saddled with him at his worst. I drove around for almost an hour looking for the store. I couldn't find it. Don Juan admitted that he might have made a mistake, that the store might be in a different town. By then, I was completely exhausted and had no idea what to do next. In my normal state of awareness, I always had the strange feeling that I knew more about him than my reason told me. Now, under the pressure of his mental deterioration, I was certain, without knowing why, that his friends were waiting for him somewhere in Mexico, although I didn't know where. My exhaustion was more than physical. It was a combination of worry and guilt. It worried me that I was stuck with a feeble old man who might, for all I knew, be mortally ill, and I felt guilty for being so disloyal to him. I parked my car near the waterfront. It took nearly 10 minutes for Don Juan to get out of the car. We walked toward the ocean, but as we got closer, Don Juan shied like a mule and refused to go on. He mumbled that the water of Guaymas Bay scared him. He turned around and led me to the main square, a dusty plaza without even benches. Don Juan sat down on the curb. A street cleaning truck went by, rotating its steel brushes, but no water was squirting into them. The cloud of dust made me cough. I was so disturbed by my situation that the thought of leaving him sitting there crossed my mind. I felt embarrassed at having had such a thought and patted Don Juan's back. "You must make an effort and tell me where I can take you," I said softly. "Where do you want me to go?"
"I want you to go to hell,"
he replied in a cracked, raspy voice. Hearing him speak to me like this, I had the suspicion that Don Juan might not have suffered from a stroke, but some other crippling brain condition that had made him lose his mind and become violent. Suddenly, he stood up and walked away from me. I noticed how frail he looked. He had aged in a matter of hours. His natural vigor was gone, and what I saw before me was a terribly old, weak man. I rushed to lend him a hand. A wave of immense pity enveloped me. I saw myself, old and weak, barely able to walk. It was intolerable. I was close to weeping, not for Don Juan, but for myself. I held his arm and made him a silent promise that I would look after him no matter what. I was lost in a reverie of self-pity when I felt the numbing force of a slap across my face. Before I recovered from the surprise, Don Juan slapped me again across the back of my neck. He was standing facing me, shivering with rage. His mouth was half open and shook uncontrollably. "Who are you?" he yelled in a strained voice. He turned to a group of onlookers who had immediately gathered. "I don't know who this man is," he said to them. "Help me. I'm a lonely old Indian. He's a foreigner and he wants to kill me. They do that to helpless old people, kill them for pleasure." There was a murmur of disapproval. Various young, husky men looked at me menacingly. "What are you doing, Don Juan?" I asked him in a loud voice. I wanted to reassure the crowd that I was with him. "I don't know you," Don Juan shouted. "Leave me alone." He turned to the crowd and asked them to help him. He wanted them to restrain me until the police came. "Hold him," he insisted, "and someone please call the police. They'll know what to do with this man." I had the image of a Mexican jail. No one would know where I was. The idea that months would go by before someone noticed my disappearance made me react with vicious speed. I kicked the first young man who came close to me, then took off at a panicked run. I knew I was running for my life. Several young men ran after me. As I raced toward the main street, I realized that in a small city like Guaymas there were policemen all over the place, patrolling on foot. There were none in sight, and before I ran into one, I entered the first store in my path. I pretended to be looking for curios. The young men running after me went by noisily. I conceived a quick plan, to buy as many things as I could. I was counting on being taken for a tourist by the people in the store. Then I was going to ask someone to help me carry the packages to my car. It took me quite a while to select what I wanted. I paid a young man in the store to help me carry my packages, but as I got closer to my car, I saw Don Juan standing by it, still surrounded by people. He was talking to a policeman who was taking notes. It was useless. My plan had failed. There was no way to get to my car. I instructed the young man to leave my packages on the sidewalk. I told him a friend of mine was going to drive by presently to take me to my hotel. He left, and I remained hidden behind the packages I was holding in front of my face, out of sight of Don Juan and the people around him. I saw the policeman examining my California license plates, and that completely convinced me I was done for. The accusation of the crazy old man was too grave, and the fact that I had run away would have only reinforced my guilt in the eyes of any policeman. Besides, I wouldn't have put it past the policeman to ignore the truth just to arrest a foreigner. I stood in the doorway for perhaps an hour. The policeman left, but the crowd remained around Don Juan, who was shouting and agitatedly moving his arms. I was too far away to hear what he was saying, but I could imagine the gist of his fast, nervous shouting. I was in desperate need of another plan. I considered checking into a hotel and waiting there for a couple of days before venturing out to get my car. I thought of going back to the store and having them call a taxi. I'd never had to hire a cab in Guaymas, and I had no idea if there were any, but my plan died instantly, with the realization that if the police were fairly competent and had taken Don Juan seriously, they would check the hotels. Perhaps the policeman had left Don Juan in order to do just that. Another alternative that crossed my mind was to get to the bus station and catch a bus to any town along the international border, or to take any bus leaving Guaymas in any direction. I abandoned the idea immediately. I was sure Don Juan had given my name to the policeman, and the police had probably already alerted the bus companies. My mind plunged into blind panic. I took short breaths to calm my nerves. I noticed then that the crowd around Don Juan was beginning to disperse. The policeman returned with a colleague, and the two of them moved away, walking slowly toward the end of the street. It was at that point that I felt a sudden, uncontrollable urge. It was as if my body were disconnected from my brain. I walked to my car, carrying all the packages. Without even the slightest trace of fear or concern, I opened the trunk, put the packages inside, then opened the driver's door. Don Juan was on the sidewalk by my car, looking at me absent-mindedly. I stared at him with a thoroughly uncharacteristic coldness. Never in my life had I had such a feeling. It wasn't hatred I felt, or even anger. I wasn't even annoyed with him. What I felt was not resignation or patience either, and it was certainly not kindness. Rather, it was a cold indifference, a frightening lack of pity. At that instant, I couldn't have cared less about what happened to Don Juan or myself. Don Juan shook his upper body the way a dog shakes itself dry after a swim. And then, as if all of it had only been a bad dream, he was again the man I knew. He quickly turned his jacket inside out. It was a reversible jacket, beige on one side and black on the other. Now he was wearing a black jacket. He threw his straw hat inside the car and carefully combed his hair. He pulled his shirt collar over the jacket collar, instantly making himself look younger. Without saying a word, he helped me put the rest of the packages in the car. When the two policemen ran back to us, blowing their whistles, drawn by the noise of the car doors being opened and closed, Don Juan very nimbly rushed to meet them. He listened to them attentively and assured them they had nothing to worry about. He explained that they must have encountered his father, a feeble old Indian who suffered from brain damage. As he talked to them, he opened and closed the car doors as if checking the locks. He moved the packages from the trunk to the back seat. His agility and youthful strength were the opposite of the old man's movements of a few minutes ago. I knew that he was acting for the benefit of the policeman who had seen him before. If I had been that man, there would have been no doubt in my mind that I was now seeing the son of the old brain-damaged Indian. Don Juan gave them the name of the restaurant where they knew his father, and then bribed them, shamelessly. I didn't bother to say anything to the policeman. There was something that made me feel hard, cold, efficient, silent. We got in the car without a word. The policemen didn't even attempt to ask me anything. They seemed too tired to even try. We drove away. "What kind of act did you pull out there, Don Juan?" I asked, and the coldness in my tone surprised me. "It was the first lesson in ruthlessness," he said. He remarked that on our way to Guaymas he had warned me about the impending lesson on ruthlessness. I confess that I hadn't paid attention because I had thought that we were just making conversation to break the monotony of driving. "I never just make conversation," he said sternly. "You should know that by now. What I did this afternoon was to create the proper situation for you to move your assemblage point to the precise spot where pity disappears. That spot is known as the place of no pity. The problem that sorcerers have to solve," he went on, "is that the place of no pity has to be reached with only minimal help. The Nagual sets the scene, but it is the apprentice who makes his assemblage point move. Today you did just that. I helped you, perhaps a bit overdramatically, by moving my own assemblage point to a specific position that made me into a feeble and unpredictable old man. I was not just acting old and feeble. I was old." The mischievous glint in his eyes told me that he was enjoying the moment. "It wasn't absolutely necessary that I do that," he went on. "I could have directed you to move your assemblage point without the hard tactics. But I couldn't help myself. Since this event will never be repeated, I wanted to know whether or not I could act, in some measure, like my own benefactor. Believe me, I surprised myself as much as I must have surprised you." I felt incredibly at ease. I had no problems in accepting what he was saying to me and no questions because I understood everything without needing him to explain. He then said something which I already knew but couldn't verbalize because I wouldn't have been able to find the appropriate words to describe it. He said that everything sorcerers did was done as a consequence of a movement of their assemblage points, and that such movements were ruled by the amount of energy sorcerers had at their command. I mentioned to Don Juan that I knew all that, and much more, and he commented that inside every human being was a gigantic, dark lake of silent knowledge, which each of us could intuit. He told me I could intuit it perhaps with a bit more clarity than the average man because of my involvement in the warrior's path. He then said that sorcerers were the only beings on earth who deliberately went beyond the intuitive level by training themselves to do two transcendental things. First, to conceive the existence of the assemblage point, and second, to make that assemblage point move. He emphasized over and over that the most sophisticated knowledge sorcerers possessed was of our potential as perceiving beings, and the knowledge that the content of perception depended on the position of the assemblage point. At that point, I began to experience a unique difficulty in concentrating on what he was saying, not because I was distracted or fatigued, but because my mind on its own had started to play the game of anticipating his words. It was as if an unknown part of myself were inside me, trying unsuccessfully to find adequate words to voice a thought. As Don Juan spoke, I felt I could anticipate how he was going to express my own silent thoughts. I was thrilled to realize his choice of words was always better than mine could have been. But anticipating his words also diminished my concentration. I abruptly pulled over to the side of the road, and right there I had, for the first time in my life, a clear knowledge of a dualism in me. Two obviously separate parts were within my being. One was extremely old, at ease, indifferent. It was heavy, dark, and connected to everything else. It was the part of me that didn't care, because it was equal to anything. It enjoyed things with no expectation. The other part was light, new, fluffy, agitated. It was nervous, fast. It cared about itself because it was insecure and didn't enjoy anything simply because it lacked the capacity to connect itself to anything. It was alone, on the surface, vulnerable. That was the part with which I looked at the world. I deliberately looked around with that part. Everywhere I looked, I saw extensive farmlands, and that insecure, fluffy, and caring part of me got caught between being proud of the industriousness of man and being sad at the sight of the magnificent old Sonoran desert turned into an orderly scene of furrows and domesticated plants. The old, dark, heavy part of me didn't care, and the two parts entered into a debate. The fluffy part wanted the heavy part to care, and the heavy part wanted the other one to stop fretting and to enjoy. "Why did you stop?" Don Juan asked. His voice produced a reaction, but it would be inaccurate to say that it was I who reacted. The sound of his voice seemed to solidify the fluffy part, and suddenly I was recognizably myself. I described to Don Juan the realization I had just had about my dualism. As he began to explain it in terms of the position of the assemblage point, I lost my solidity. The fluffy part became as fluffy as it had been when I first noticed my dualism, and once again I knew what Don Juan was explaining. He said that when the assemblage point moves and reaches the place of no pity, the position of rationality and common sense becomes weak. The sensation I was having of an older, dark, silent side was a view of the antecedents of reason. "I know exactly what you're saying," I told him. "I know a great number of things, but I can't speak of what I know. I don't know how to begin." "I have mentioned this to you already," he said. "What you are experiencing and called dualism is a view from another position of your assemblage point. From that position, you can feel the older side of man. And what the older side of man knows is called silent knowledge. It's a knowledge that you cannot yet voice." "Why not?" I asked. "Because in order to voice it, it is necessary for you to have and use an inordinate amount of energy," he replied. "You don't at this time have that kind of energy to spare." "Silent knowledge is something that all of us have," he went on. "Something that has complete mastery, complete knowledge of everything, but it cannot think. Therefore, it cannot speak of what it knows. Sorcerers believe that when man became aware that he knew and wanted to be conscious of what he knew, he lost sight of what he knew. This silent knowledge which you cannot describe is, of course, intent, the spirit, the abstract. Man's error was to want to know it directly, the way he knew everyday life. The more he wanted, the more ephemeral it became." "But what does that mean in plain words, Don Juan?" I asked. "It means that man gave up silent knowledge for the world of reason," he replied. "The more he clings to the world of reason, the more ephemeral intent becomes." I started the car, and we drove in silence. Don Juan didn't attempt to give me directions or tell me how to drive, a thing he often did in order to exacerbate my self-importance. I had no clear idea where I was going, yet something in me knew. I let that part take over.